Hi, Startup 260. This is Professor Jensen here, and today we're going to talk about how you can debug in your development environment when you actually build your React application. So there's some special things that come into play when you're trying to debug in your development environment using React, and that's because React, the npm start will actually start up the React scripts program, and that will actually launch a hot reloading HTTP server for you. And that's going to get in the way of your backend Node.js debugging, which also wants to launch and normally would serve up your React application after it's been bundled using npm build. But since we actually want to debug both the front end and the back end at the same time, you have to do some configuration changes to actually make that work. So to kind of show you what that means, we can go over here to this diagram and show that, first of all, what it looks like in your production environment, which actually is much easier than your development environment. It just works pretty much normally. So here's the diagram for them. And what's happened is we previously ran npm build to actually bundle up your React application, your front end code. And that just builds a whole bunch of static files that you just host in your public directory of your Node.js HTTP server. That's going to just load those up using that middleware, express static public, load these files up when they're asked for. And so all of your front end React code automatically just gets hosted and loaded up through your Node.js server, listening on port 3000. Very similar to like everything that we've done since we started doing web services. And that all works fine. If there's an API request that comes in for like API scores, for example, with Simon, then your Node.js server has an endpoint for that, and it picks it up and it goes and talks to the database and returns those scores automatically. So the short of it is that your Node.js server handles everything for you, both the hosting of your static your static front end files, which are your bundled Node.js files, your bundled React files, to serve those all up. And there's also, it handles your endpoints to be able to serve those up just normally. The tricky part comes when you're in your development environment. Now, instead of actually bundling that front end code up and then hosting it under your Node.js service, you actually want to be able to use the React debugging functionality by running npm start to launch a hot reloading HTTP server that's mainly tasked with just loading your front end code dynamically, so that you can change it at your code and it will automatically reload that front end code into your browser. But that's going to get in the way of Node.js running as your backend, because when we're in production, we want them both to be running on port 3000. But when you're debugging, it has to be, you actually literally have two HTTP servers going, one for your backend and one actually handling your front end code temporarily in a development kind of environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to first of all change the React debugging environment, that HTTP server for debugging your React application, to listen on port 3001 instead of what our backend service, our Node.js service, is going to be listening on port 3000. Then we're going to tell React that if it gets a request that it doesn't know what to do with, such as an API scores request, which, because it's only hosting the front end code, it won't know how to handle, we're going to tell it to proxy that through to our backend service, which is listening on port 3000. So with those two things in place, we're all set. We just need to make one more change, and that's for WebSockets. Normally, your WebSockets would be going to the same port that your front-end application actually retrieved its code from initially, but instead, that would be port 3001. Instead, in debugging, we want to say, no, if you're in debugging, then I want you to go directly to the backend service 3000, which actually is handling our WebSocket communication. So we're going to make those three changes. First, to tell the front-end HTTP React debugger to listen on port 3001. Second, to proxy API requests through 3001 over to 3000. And then finally, to tell the front-end code when it's making a WebSocket request to go to port 3000. Okay, so how does that actually all work? And I should mention, if you go to the instruction and scroll down to the React Simon version, which is down here way at the bottom, that all of this is actually documented there, and it'll step you through it, so you can look at that too. It's down after it shows you how to port the app over. There's a section which says how to set up for debugging, and it's going to walk you through all these things that we just talked about here, showing what it is for production and what it is for development. This shows you how to set the port to 3000 for debugging in React, how to modify the package.json in order to the proxy, and then finally how to change the WebSocket functionality so that when you're not in production, it actually just talks directly to port 3000 and ignores the port that the application is normally talking on. So let's go look at the code now to see where those three things happen. First, let's look at the environment variable files. So this is the one here that says when you launch React by running npm start, we want it to use port 3001 instead of 3000. So if I come here now and type npm start, this is going to start right up, and it's going to launch it and listening now, see, on port 3001 instead of 3000 like it normally would have done by default. So that's overriding the port that you want to use when debugging. Okay, the next thing that you want to do is you want to go into the package.json for your React application, and you're going to add a line right here which says proxy request that I don't know about to go to localhost, the same machine that I'm on, but I want you to talk to port 3000 instead of 3001. So that will take requests that are made to the front end code, and it will proxy it through and send them to our back end code, which is listening on 3000. And then the last thing that we need to change, if we go into the code for our React service, and in this case I'm showing you the Simon code, so the WebSocket handling code here is in a file called game notifier, which handles all the WebSocket communication. And what this is doing is when it starts up, I want to check to see what port I'm actually listening on. So if and I'm going to change it depending on whether I'm in a production mode or non-production mode. So there is this hard-coded value that gets set when you compile your React code, and it's going to tell you what the environment is that you're executing on. So if I'm not in a production mode, then I always wanted to force it to be port 3000, which is where my backend service is going to be listening on, is port 3000. So that forces it to, when I'm doing a WebSocket communication, which is what all this code is doing, is setting up your WebSocket communication, like right here, that it's going to go to port 3000 instead of the one that it's normally using by the application. And those are the three changes that you have to make in order to make it work for debugging. So I can come over here to my service, and I'm going to just start up my backend service here by pushing F5 on the index.js file, which is all my Express middleware endpoint handling. So now I've got my backend service running because I just started up the Visual Studio Code debugger on that. And I've got my front end running because I went over to the terminal and did npm start here to run my front end HTTP server. So I'll start that again, npm start, just to show you how that works. This time I don't get any error because my back end's actually working. You can see that it's actually talking to my back end. So because it loaded up, like if I go over to scores, you can see all my scores get loaded. Everything's working great there. I can actually set breakpoints on my backend code here, for example, to get the scores. Right here. If I come back to my front end here and refresh, you can see it hits my back end endpoint because it's actually, the request actually went to port 3001, the React debugging HTTP server, and then it said, oh, I don't know what to do with this, so I'm going to forward it because of that setting that I put in here in the package.json. I'm going to proxy that over to port 3000 where my backend service is actually listening. And that's where I hit my breakpoint. So if I debug, I can now see all that going through here. If I come back over here to the browser, you can see that this code gets actually hit here when I refresh. So if I reconnect basically my WebSocket again, you'll see that constructor setting up my WebSockets is going to say, okay, what's my normal port that I'm using? And it's saying, oh, it's 3001. But this environment variable here is not set to production, so I'm going to switch it to 3000, and that allows all my WebSocket communication to actually go through and work just fine. So I can go ahead and just push F8 here, and that will all load up normally. And so that's doing the handling of the WebSocket communication there. So between those three settings, which are all discussed right here, of setting your default port for React debugging to be 3001, and then changing it so it will proxy your request to your backend if the React debugger does not handle it, and then also setting up your WebSocket so that if you're not in production mode, it's going to skip the normal port that it would have talked to because it's actually hosting up the front end files through your React debugger to instead just go straight to your backend code that's listening on port 3000. If you make those three changes, then you're all set and you'll be able to develop in your environment, your development environment, without any problems. Both your back end and your front end environments for your React coding. All right, best wishes and great luck.